Norman Vincent Peale was a famous American theologian of the last century, author, and speaker. And in his travels around the United States, he once remarked that wherever you see the church, you see the American flag. In my church for many years, the American flag was always prominently displayed in the chancel until a certain point, I think it was the mid 90s, it just kind of just disappeared. And when I asked about it, they said, well, we didn't have room for it anymore. And they actually signaled in my recollection that kind of a shift in the church from more conservative traditional values to more of a liberal progressive bent. At the funeral for one of our pastors, John Boyle, I was struck when the American flag made a dramatic reappearance, because John Boyle had been a veteran of the Second World War. And during the service, his casket was draped with American flag, prominently displayed in the chancel as an Army officer stood off to the side at attention during the entire service under the pulpit. He stood at attention listening to the entire recount of John's life. John Buchanan described John Boyle as so handsome, as something like out of central casting. And he talked a little bit about John growing up in Norman Vincent Peale's church, being baptized by Norman Vincent Peale, and how later he himself found a calling to the ministry, serving in the Army, and walking through a landmine field carrying a Bible. John's Second World War II story also included a dramatic, liberating Buchenwald story, which I heard numerous times in men's Bible study class. And recounting the details of his service and ministry as pastor for 40 years. At the end of the service, they reverently folded up the American flag and handed it to his wife, Kathy. I was so struck by that. It's the example of the best kind of separation of church and state. Welcome to Conservative Coffee Hour. I'm Stanley Smith. At Conservative Coffee Hour, I think we're trying to break down some of the separation between talk and action, hyperbole, and constructive conversations, adult conversations about ideas, about values, and about outcomes. And trying to be aware, when we're being triggered, how we're being triggered, and if we're simply just reacting or if we're being proactive. I went to a seminar last summer sponsored by the Chicago Humanities Festival about the topic of classical liberalism. And the idea of classical liberalism itself, is the idea that freedom is a concept that should be liberally available to everybody. I think that's something that probably we all agree on as a starting point. And it points up to the idea of the troublesome nature sometimes with words, the idea of classical liberalism, and liberalism meaning freedom and equality for everybody, somehow gets tricked up into a political partisan message. My cousin, who actually teaches English as a foreign language in the Netherlands, shared with me once the example of different words that simply don't translate. And in Holland, he said the word used for liberal really does not have the similar meaning here in the United States. He said the word liberal in Holland means conservative. So he has to explain to people when he's teaching the English language, American English, that the term liberal here in the United States means something quite the opposite. We we have to take into account, are we being reactionary, or are we being progressive? In our country, the word liberal really means progressive now. And in theory, we would all like to be progressive, but the progressive part of that has been politicized. It points up to the idea of how our actions align with our words. I recently came across the psychological analysis of different personalities, and most people fall into one of the two types in regard to actions and words and beliefs, and that's the ego syntonic, the idea of our words and actions and beliefs, our beliefs hang with our actions. That's the synergy, the ego syntonic view of personality. And then the ego dystonic is the idea of people saying one thing and doing something completely the opposite. So I think we can see very quickly how we might fall in one or the other, or a little bit of both. Nobody is completely one thing. So a good example of, to me, of ego dystonic is we can't encourage people to vote, and then criticize them for who they vote for. It's not helpful, and it's really not our place. This is a example of being ego dystonic. We can't say and preach one thing and then do the other. It's counter to our stated values. We either have to adjust our values or adjust our actions. It's not right or wrong. We're not here to shame anybody or correct anybody. It's all part of human nature, and part of it is being aware of who we are and how we're acting, how we're being triggered, and how our thoughts and words translate into positive actions. Then we can have a real conversation. I was having a real conversation this week at the East Bank Club in the infamous sauna, where all great conversations start. And this conversation was about Adam in the Garden of Eden. And before Eve was created, what did Adam really have? Did he have both male and female parts, or just male parts? And then if he just had the male parts, well, really, what was going on until Eve arrived? And just as we were discussing whether Adam had a vagina or not, someone immediately brought up the topic of Lori Lightfoot. It's in the sauna, it seemed like a natural transition. And someone spoke up that Lori was, of course, the worst mayor that Chicago had ever had. And then a couple of younger people asked, well, can you give specific instances of why Lori was a bad mayor, or what she could have done or didn't do that would have made a difference? And I will say that in retrospect, I came up with a list. It's a very good question, and we should have had quick and decisive answers for that question. But the answers are that she didn't call up the National Guard when we were having civil unrest. And also throughout Lori's tenure, she didn't ask for help, and she never had the demeanor of asking for help and being open to anyone's suggestions or ideas. I think many of us, we all would have been happy to offer positive, constructive support for any action that we thought was going to support our values in this city. And also that she negated the value of personal property and merchandise and materials that were lost during the pandemic. She really discounted that and separated that from the idea of personal property being an extension of personal autonomy and materials. So, but I was more impressed though was the fact that these young people, they were interested in having a real conversation instead of just having a shouting match and calling people's names. So we need to be open for having these real conversations, and we need to be ready to engage. We need to be a mentor in these moments with our words and our actions. We just can't explode into a huff and get into a shouting match with people, because it's doing a disservice to whatever ideas we have, and it's doing a disservice to the listener. Last week on this call, we talked about the Second Amendment and how the Second Amendment is intended and is supposed to be a check on the government. So this week we're looking at, well, why wouldn't the churches be a similar check? We hear about the separation of church and state, and why is that? Are they supposed to operate in a vacuum separately of each other, or is that for an intended reason? And perhaps that intended reason is to be a voice and a moral compass. And recently I've heard from more than one different areas of the lament. Where are the voices in our time? Last week I suggested the topic of Marianne Williamson, and I contacted the people at the 17 Church of Christ to see if they'd be open to a speaker, and I suggested Marianne Williamson just as a placeholder, as an idea of what that might look like. And I immediately heard back that they can't be political because they're a church. And I was struck by that, because I didn't really consider Marianne Williamson a political person. She has over 40 years in the spiritual development arena, and she just happens to have been a candidate for president. And I found it interesting that she was disqualified, because I think that would have been the perfect person. She would have been the ideal person to speak about religion and politics. It's an example of how our words and actions don't always hang together. There are many examples of this between words and how our actions just don't connect in society. And I think examples of that are topics of homelessness, poverty, poor education, crime, incarceration, and unwanted pregnancies. We all intuitively know that people should be living better. We should have good education for our children. People should not be sleeping on the streets. None of this hangs with our values, but our actions keep perpetuating it. They say that every system works optimally all the time for the results. So whatever results we see in society today is a direct result of the system working optimally. If you want to change the results, you need to change the way the system operates. But all of this is not intended to be an indictment. It's all part of human nature. It's who we are. We need to, we all navigate this every day in our own lives optimally, and we can make small incremental improvements if we change how we operate. The church is supposed to be in the business of human nature. They're in the human nature business. That's what it's all about. But where's the conversation there? Are they making incremental changes? Are we seeing incremental changes in congregations? Or are they just banging us over the head with don't do this and don't do that and be this instead? Is that really a helpful conversation to be having? Instead of looking at simply who we are and seeing that person who's in front of us and working with that person, seeing every person as an opportunity instead of an obstacle. Life is not easy. It's not a cakewalk. It's not about avoiding adult conversations. It's about meeting people where they are and having the conversations we need to be having. It's not supposed to be like walking through a landmine field. In Dietrich Bonhoeffer's time, he saw himself in a similar dangerous time, not unlike our own, and he wondered the same thing: where are the voices? And he also wondered, where is the church? Dietrich Bonhoeffer found himself ultimately engaged in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler, and he himself was executed for being involved in this plot. So is that an example of his beliefs being in line with his actions? I mean, I think you could make a case for both instances. He probably believed in life and believed in people's, do not kill, but he found himself involved in a plot to kill somebody. It's an idea, an example of how life doesn't always have clear-cut answers, but people take action and it's either aligned or not aligned, and sometimes it's both. It's similar to the idea that we cannot encourage people to vote and then criticize who they vote for. It's an oxymoron. We also can't defend Lori Lightfoot. We don't need to figure out what's happening in the Garden of Eden, and all we need to do is just navigate this conversation. This week we'll be navigating the conversation about where is the church, and this will take place at the Saturday Conservative Coffee Hour, which is every Saturday at 10 a.m. Central Time on Zoom. I will include my email in the description of this video. I'll be happy to send you an invitation, and I look forward to seeing you very, very soon.